Lecture 50, Jean Racine.
In this second lecture, we turn from Molière to Jean Racine, who was born in 1639 and died in 1699. Jean Racine was the genius of French neoclassical tragedy, as Molière was of its comedy. Indeed, Molière was instrumental in helping Racine to establish himself as a playwright in Paris in the 1660s. Like Molière, Racine was a child of the upper middle class. His father was a provincial government official. And Racine was orphaned when he was 4 and was raised by his grandmother, who took him when he was 12 to the convent of Port Royal, to which she had retired when she was widowed. Port Royal was the center of the Jansenist movement, and there Racine studied Latin and Greek, and when he was 18, was sent by the Jansenists to Paris to study law. This was a mistake because the young man who read voraciously even those books banned by the Jansenists did not take too well to his studies and fell in with the wrong sort, the theatre crowd, especially anathema to the Jansenists who disapproved of the theatre. It was Molière's troupe that first produced Racine's first play, The Thebans, in 1664, a play that was poorly received by the public and critics, although out of friendship to Racine, Molière kept the play in his theatre at a loss to himself. Racine quickly became famous with his second play, Alexander the Great, which was produced in 1665, again by Molière, with a splendid set design, even though the first play's failure hardly justified this. Racine repaid Molière for his generosity and support by switching theatrical troupes even as Molière's troupe was performing Alexander the Great. Such duplicity was followed by Racine's successful efforts to persuade his mistress, one of Molière's leading actresses, to leave Molière's troupe and join that of a rival company that was performing Racine's plays. The two playwrights never spoke again. Although Racine braved the disapproval of his Jansenist teachers when he first entered the theatre, he gradually came to incorporate more and more of their teaching in his work, and he finally abandoned secular drama entirely. Jansenism followed the teachings of a Dutch theologian, Cornelius Jansen, 1585 to 1638. Jansen resisted the humanist tendencies of the Renaissance, arguing that salvation was not for all Christians, but only those predestined by God. Even those striving to be good, like Phaedra, are doomed to die, steeped in sin, unforgiven. Thus, Jansenism might be said to be the Catholic version of Calvinism, with which it was often compared by church authorities eager to discredit it. In 1644, the Archbishop of Paris had proscribed the works of Jansen, and after several fruitless admonitions was forced to debar them from receiving the sacraments. Jansenists practice a rigorous, self-denying form of Catholicism, and then in their refusal to yield before either the Pope or the King, encouraged a belief in freedom of religion and thought that was potentially revolutionary. Racine's increasing interest in the religious thought of his early years caused him to leave Paris and the theatre in 1677 and return to the Abbey of Port Royal, where he had been educated. After reconciling with the Jansenists, Racine, who had built quite a reputation for seducing young actresses, married a pious woman who refused to read a single line of his plays and with whom he would have 7 children. His marriage and appointment as historian to Louis XIV confirmed his distance from the life of the theatre, and in his final years he wrote 2 plays based upon biblical characters, which articulate a clear relationship to Jansenist belief. Phaedra, produced in 1677, is thus his last secular play. I want to talk briefly about the aesthetic and physical restraints of the neoclassical theatre within which Racine and Molière both wrote. The theatrical space was a long, narrow room. In fact, on occasions, theatrical troupes would use tennis courts that were no longer in use as their stage. So it was a long, narrow room with a raised stage at one end, a proscenium arch, and separating the stage from the audience, and a front curtain. There was a single piece of painted scenery which represented one particular place, such as a room in the palace. The playwright, especially the tragic author, observed the three unities of time, space, and action that have been attributed to Aristotle. The unity of time required that the action of the play last no longer than 12 or at the most 24 hours. The unity of place required that the action take place in one location, and the unity of action required that the speech and action all speak to the main plot. Neoclassical propriety also forbade physical violence or passion on the stage and required the representation of only noble characters. If this was not enough, the playwright was further confined by the verse form. This was rhymed couplets in a verse line of 12 syllables, the Alexandrine line, delivered in tragedy, at least, in long declamatory speeches. Now, these conventions would have seemed artificial to the 17th century audience, just as they do now to us, but they would have been a familiar convention, just as the conventions, for example, that govern the classic Western movie or the unity of time in a TV drama like 24 Hours, for example, where each hour of TV time equals 1 hour of lived experience. We understand that those are conventions. Despite, or perhaps because of these severe limitations, Racine's recreations of classical Greek tragedy are masterpieces of the representation of psychological conflict. In Phaedra, the elegant simplicity of style and form and his investment in a character produces a subtle probing of moral and ethical complexities. The suspense and emotional intensity comes not from the intricate plot, but rather from the psychological drama, the contest between characters. Racine reworked classical conventions to write a play that respects the unities of time, place, and action. He has reduced the action to its bare bones. There are no subplots, no digressions, no characters extraneous to the main action, at the same time as the play invokes this huge mythical past. And even though he represents no scene of passion on stage, except significantly the death of Phaedra, the play is suffused with the consequences of violence and lust. Moreover, the limitations of the verse form illustrate the failure of language to articulate these passions of lust, love, and revenge. Thus, the contrived nature of the language becomes not a hindrance to the representation of human emotion, but its very condition. To be human is not to be able to speak clearly of what one feels, especially when consumed by passion. So Racine depicted the probable and the likely in the human condition despite his reliance on mythical narratives for his plots. In his plays, the gods and heroes struggle with the same passions and the same limitations as man, and thus his plays concentrate on character rather than event, focusing on the internal and psychological display rather than the heroic display of virtue in the public space of battle or court. Focusing on this psychological then rather than the public space of battle and court, Racine offers us an early hint of what will become pronounced by the end of the 18th century. That is, the focus on the interior self, on the psychological nature of the human condition. Before I turn to the play itself, let me address briefly Racine's preface to the play, in which he attempts to reconcile his Jansenist beliefs with his passion for the theatre. Like Molière and other neoclassical writers, especially those attacked by the authorities for anything that seems scandalous or provocative, sexually, politically, or religiously, Racine relies upon the Horatian justification for his work. Art should be both educative and entertaining. It should in fact do one, that is teach, by doing the other, that is entertain. He argues that what I can affirm is that in no other play of mine is virtue given greater prominence. The slightest transgressions are severely punished. The very thought of crime is regarded with as much horror as crime itself. Weaknesses caused by love are treated as real weaknesses. Moreover, Racine insists that not only has he followed this classical precept, but that he has returned to classical sources for his subject matter. He claims that he has been faithful to classical authorities in his version of the story of Phaedra and Hippolytus, that he has borrowed from Euripides' play Hippolytus, first played in 428 BC, and only followed a slightly different route from that author. It is true that Racine follows the main outline of Euripides' plot, but he has changed the focus from Hippolytus to Phaedra, as the change in title indicates. Euripides shows us a Hippolytus destroyed by Aphrodite, a man who refuses to fall in love with a woman, whereas Racine focuses on Phaedra and her futile struggle to overcome her incestuous love for her stepson. In Euripides, Phaedra is another victim of Aphrodite's power, her love for Hippolytus the result of the goddess's curse. In Racine, Phaedra's obsession for her stepson is a monstrous reflection of her mother's own obsession with a white bull, the result of which is the Minotaur. Euripides' play depicts the relationship of humans to gods, whereas Racine's play addresses the essentially human and therefore arbitrary nature of passion. Racine's Phaedra then undermines the Renaissance belief in self-discipline and reason and sees undisciplined passion as the central reality of the human world, a world that is thereby tragic. Thus, Racine argues that his plays are as worthy as classical sources to teach virtue. Indeed, he wishes that modern writers were as sound and full of precepts as these poets. This might perhaps provide a means of reconciling to tragedy a host of people famous for their piety and their doctrine. He's talking about the Jansenists, who have recently condemned it and who would no doubt pass a more favorable judgment on it if writers were as keen to edify their spectators as to amuse them, thereby complying with the real purpose of tragedy. Let me turn now to the play. Racine relies on the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. In this myth, Minos, king of Crete, has boasted that the gods would grant him any wish, dangerous, and he has prayed to Poseidon to send him a bull from the sea. Miraculously, a beautiful white bull comes ashore, a bull that is supposed to be sacrificed to Poseidon, but Minos keeps it and instead sacrifices another bull from his herd. In revenge, Poseidon causes Minos' queen, Pasiphae, to fall in love with the bull, and she consequently gives birth to the Minotaur, a creature with a man's body and a bull's head. Theseus comes to Crete to kill the Minotaur, which Minos has now imprisoned in the center of an impenetrable labyrinth. Supplied with both a sword by Ariadne, Minos' daughter, and the clever scheme of leaving a trail of thread so that he can find his way out of the labyrinth, Theseus enters the labyrinth, kills the Minotaur, returns back to Ariadne. He flees Crete with her, but soon abandons her for her sister, Phaedra. Phaedra is about two versions of the love that dares not speak its name. The first of these loves is Hippolytus's, for a woman from a family that has risen up against Theseus and who Theseus has condemned to perpetual chastity. The second is Phaedra's love for her stepson, Hippolytus. Theseus's reputation as a slayer of monsters, as well as a philanderer, is invoked repeatedly throughout the play. Uncontrolled passion of various kinds is the monster that constantly threatens disorder. Racine is asking an essentially modern question. What is the nature of the monstrous? Or what is the nature of evil? The two revelations of love, Hippolytus for the woman that his father has condemned to chastity, and Phaedra's to her stepson, these two confessions of love are made in the absence of Theseus, who is rumored to be dead. As in Molière, when the father does not act as the father, either because he is absent or irrational, the family structure is thrown into disorder. there is a brief window of opportunity for these revelations of love to be made, which are also assertions of defiance of the father and the husband and the lawgiver. And the articulation of that defiance by both Phaedra and Hippolytus is punished with death. Act 1 focuses on the relationship between the father Theseus and his son Hippolytus. When Hippolytus announces he must leave his homeland to search for his father and to test his own manhood, that is, to become himself, we are reminded of another father-son relationship famous in classical narrative. That is the relationship between Telemachus and his father Odysseus, which opens with a similar scene of disharmony and disorder in the household of the absent father. Like Telemachus, Hippolytus is dwarfed by the reputation of his father, a double reputation as both the heroic slayer of monsters and the promiscuous slayer of women, including Hippolyta, whom, according to some versions of the myth, Theseus has abandoned for Phaedra. Thus, while Hippolytus wishes to emulate his father in one respect, as the heroic figure, he wants to distinguish himself, to distance himself from the father who philanders. Hippolytus's tutor, Theramenes, discovers that Hippolytus is really leaving because he has an ungovernable passion for Aricia, the last living member of a family that Theseus has killed. Hippolytus has resisted love because he does not wish to emulate his philandering father, and because now he has fallen in love with a woman his father hates. For Hippolytus, then, the monster is filial disobedience. But there is another, even more terrible and unseen, unknown monster that threatens Hippolytus, and that is Phaedra's illicit passion. At the rumor of Theseus's death, and thus in the absence of the father, the patriarch, the lawgiver, Phaedra's nurse, Oenone, tempts Phaedra to speak of that which she would rather die than confess. That is, her love for Hippolytus. Oenone says, "Your destiny now wears a different face. The king is dead, and you must take his place. He leaves a son who needs your sheltering wing, a slave without you, if you live, a king. Live then. There's nothing now you're guilty of. Your love's become like any other love. With Theseus's death, those bonds exist no more, which made your passion something to abhor. With Theseus's apparent death, Phaedra's love for Hippolytus is, according to Oenone at least, no longer monstrous. Further, Hippolytus's love for Aricia is likewise freed from restraint. Hippolytus appears to be fatherless, and thus immediately assumes his father's position. He becomes the father. He's the son who inherits and therefore becomes the father. And Phaedra appears to be widowed and is free, therefore, to substitute the son for the father. It's almost as if she's going to remain married to Theseus, but in the form of Hippolytus. When Hippolytus visits Aricia to say farewell, Aricia's confidant, Ismene, like Oenone, persuades Aricia to speak of her love. Aricia claims that she has not minded her forced chastity because she grieves her dead brothers slain by Theseus. Now he has become the slayer of men as well as of monsters and women. I only escaped, says Aricia, the rage of war. I lost 6 brothers, young and fresh as May, in whom the hopes of our great lineage lay. The sharp sword reaped them all. She has not loved until Hippolytus, she says, whom she loves not for his beauty, but for his nobility, a quality that he possesses that comes without his father's weaknesses. I find in him far nobler gifts than these, his father's strengths without his frailties. I love, I own, a heart that's never bowed beneath love's yoke, but stayed aloof and proud. Hippolytus, acting as his father, frees Aricia, and her amazement at his generosity compels Hippolytus's confession. He says, I'm counted rough and proud, but don't assume that I'm the issue of some monster's womb, like Phaedra's mother's child, the Minotaur. What hate-filled heart, what brute, however wild, could look upon your face and not grow mild? Although Hippolytus's love is not like his father's promiscuity, it is no less passionate. He says, "To think how I, love's enemy, long disdained its bonds, and all whom passion had enchained, and now, like common men, for all my pride, am lost to reason in a raging tide. What use to struggle? I am not as before. I seek myself, and find myself no more." Note Racine's essentially modern representation of love as a loss of identity, not as a curse or a blessing from Venus. In other words, this is a thoroughly human emotion, and like Phaedra's love for Hippolytus, is the responsibility of the one who feels it. It is not a burden imposed by the gods. This confession of love between Aricia and Hippolytus is juxtaposed immediately with the great scene of Phaedra's confession of her love to Hippolytus. Initially disguising it as passion for Theseus, she then moves seamlessly from describing Theseus when she first saw him to her first impression of Hippolytus. Phaedra succeeds, at least in terms of her rhetorical gesture, in erasing the incestuous nature of her love for the son by substituting that son for his dead father. Once again, we note the insight with which Racine depicts the interior struggle that Phaedra undergoes as she wavers between desiring Hippolytus and recognizing that he is her husband's son. "I burn for him with starved desire," she says, speaking of Theseus, "though not as he was seen among the shades, the fickle worshipper of 1,000 maids, but constant, proud, a little shy as well, young, charming, irresistible, much as we depict our gods, or as you look to me." Or as you look to me? He had your eyes, your voice, your virile grace. It was your noble blush that tinged his face. Now the son becomes the father the son. When crossing on the waves, he came to Crete and made the hearts of Minos' daughters beat. Phaedra then goes on to rehearse the slaying of the Minotaur, only now it's Hippolytus and Phaedra, not Theseus and Ariadne. Inspired by love, the plan would have been mine. It's I who would have helped you solve the maze, my prince, and taught you all its twisting ways, what I'd have done to save that charming head. My love would not have trusted to a thread. No, Phaedra would have wished to share with you your perils, would have wished to lead you through the labyrinth, and thence have side by side returned with you, or else with you have died. Phaedra's confession of her love for Hippolytus is monstrous, as is Theseus's treatment of women, but it is also heroic, as is Theseus's slaying of monsters. For a woman, however, neither philandering nor heroic action is possible. The only outcome of her confession can be death. Phaedra demands that Hippolytus rid the world like your heroic sire of one more monster. She specifically demands that he kill her with a sword, which is a gift from Theseus. Could it be the same sword given to him by Ariadne with which he killed the Minotaur? The gift from his father marks not only his identity as Theseus' son, and therefore the fact that he is off limits to Phaedra, but also confirms his manhood, which of course is precisely what provokes Phaedra's desire. And so her demand that he kill her is articulated in the language of sexual desire. "Here is my heart, your blade must pierce me there. In haste to expiate its wicked lust, my heart already leaps to meet your thrust." Here, the slaying of monsters and the slaying of women as sexual objects, both things his father is known for, are literally and figuratively embodied in Phaedra's plea for her death. Hippolytus, however, is not Theseus. He cannot slay the monster any more than he can slay, that is, seduce women. And he flees, leaving the sword, defiled and stained, as is his own identity, his manhood, stained by Phaedra's touch. Theseus returns and reestablishes his law, literally and figuratively coming between the mother and the stepson, and between his son and the forbidden love he has for Aricia. With the patriarchy restored, Hippolytus now becomes a monster to Phaedra, who must slay him before he destroys her. Phaedra shifts the charge of monster from herself to Hippolytus, from the one who has inspired the lust, from the one who suffers the lust, rather, to the one who has inspired it. This is a psychologically accurate representation of guilt that Racine offers us. Phaedra's maid, Oenone, argues for a preemptive accusation. But even if guiltless blood must flow, she says, the cost were less than if your honor should be lost. That honor is too dear to risk. Its cause is priceless, and its dictates are your laws. You must give up, since honor is at stake, everything, even virtue, for its sake. Oenone hints to Theseus that something terrible has happened while he has been gone, and Phaedra keeps silence. Now, when she should speak, she does not. Just as before, when she should have remained silent about her love, she spoke. Theseus rushes to judgment against his son, and we understand in this immediate burst of passion Racine's view of that emotion. Passion is brutal. It is instinctive, and it is destructive. It is that which causes fathers to kill their sons. Theseus, the slayer of monsters, now sees his son as one. Monster, at whom Jove's thunder should be hurled, foul brigand like those of whom I cleaned the world, now that your vile and unnatural love has led you even to attempt your father's bed, how dare you show your hated face to me, here in the precincts of your infamy? Theseus is now lost to passion, just like Phaedra, and he prays to Neptune to grant his wish to bring revenge against his son. And of course, we recall Minos' prayer to Poseidon and the horror of Pasiphae and the white bull. Hearing of Hippolytus' love for Aricia, we now see also the other side of Phaedra's passion, revenge. Phaedra determines to have Aricia killed. We see that the two sides of passion, then, are the two sides of the same coin. Immoderate passion on the one hand leads to hate on the other, just as we saw in the way Orgon responded to Tartuffe's exposure. Only when Phaedra imagines herself pleading for Aricia's death does she understand the depths of her crimes. The measure of my crimes is now replete. I foul the air with incest and deceit. My murderous hands are itching to be stained with innocent blood, that vengeance be obtained. In the final scenes of the play, those who have loved immoderately or in defiance of the father's wishes are punished. In imitation of his father, the slayer of monsters, Hippolytus destroys the sea monster sent by Neptune to answer Theseus' prayers, but Hippolytus is dragged to death by his horses, with whom he is identified. The Greek for horse is hippos, thus the name Hippolytus. Phaedra takes poison. She confesses and exonerates Hippolytus, and here Racine breaks the neoclassical convention, as I said, by representing her death on stage. Phaedra insists that Theseus witness her death so that he see now what he could not see before, that is, her guilt and Hippolytus' innocence. Theseus is finally left alone. Precisely that which made him the heroic slayer of monsters has made him the monstrous slayer of his own son, that is, passion, heroic passion. As recompense for the damage that he's wrought, he takes Aricia as his daughter. The story of Phaedra and Hippolytus is an allegory, then, an allegory of the monstrous power of love and its capacity to bring both death and suffering. It is an allegory articulated in Phaedra's mother's passion for the white bull, in Theseus' passion for Hippolytus' mother, Hippolytus's mother Hippolyta, for Phaedra's sister Ariadne, for Phaedra and for many other women. And it is an allegory enacted in Phaedra's passion for Hippolytus. No love, not even the conventional love of Hippolytus for Aricia, is safe from the brutal forces of human passion. We are left with the judgment of the gods, who resemble the severe God of Jansenist theology. And that judgment is that only strict moral examination and self-denial can save us. The death of Neptune's sea monster and Theseus's rejection of the gods' high patronage leaves us in a world of human history that is essentially tragic and unredeemed by any divine presence. This is definitely not the world of Molière, who consistently held out hope for the improvement of humankind through education and the proper use of reason. It is a world of monstrous instinctive passions that overwhelm all moral certainties.